Welcome back to the FCGN podcast. My name is Barry Odell, and I am your host. FCGN is an initialism, stands for Fulton County Gospel News, which is a bi-monthly periodical put out by the Church of Christ here in Mammoth Spring, Arkansas. So we started this podcast a couple of months ago in an effort to further the reach of Fulton County Gospel News. This paper has been in publication since 1953 here in Fulton County, Arkansas. And up until the pandemic hit in 2020, we were mailing nearly 10,000 copies of the paper out all over the world. About 6,300 copies here around the United States. I think we hit 49 of the 50 states. But then we also would send about 3,500 copies overseas. Well, when the pandemic hit, all of our foreign mailing got shut down. And so that cut our reach, I guess you would say, by by a third at least, perhaps a little bit more than 1/3. And so this is a thought that I had come up with to give another avenue of reach, if you will, for the Fulton County Gospel News. We don't know if our foreign mailing will ever start back. We just don't know. Anyway, we started this podcast, and so this is episode number 3. And we're working right now. What we're doing with this podcast is just basically discussing the current edition of the paper. Each paper typically has 3 articles, one by me, the editor, and then I'll get at least one, and most of the time 2 other writers to contribute an article on a given topic, given subject. We're currently going through a subject, or through a theme, I guess I would say, entitled I Believe. And I started from Genesis chapter 1. And I don't know how long this series of articles is going to last, but let me tell you, there's plenty of biblical content to go around for a long time. So naturally, you open your Bible and you read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." The first 2 chapters of the Bible begin with the creation account. So really the first article in this series of I Believe is entitled I Believe in the Genesis account of creation. And this article was written by one of the contributors, and he did an excellent job with it, so I thought that we would discuss it. You know, there is quite a range of views on the Genesis account of creation. And I'll say not just the account of creation, but many, if not most, of the first, 10 or 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, there's debate on what I would call the historical veracity of those accounts. So we're going to look at this. We're going to think about it today, in particular, not all 11 chapters, but in particular the first 2 chapters of Genesis and the biblical account of creation. Of course, the prevailing thoughts are Darwinian evolution. You know, the not just the earth, but the universe itself. Everything that exists is at a minimum 4 billion years old. And of course, we're not here to discuss, in a sense, the general theory of evolution, but we do, I would say most of us understand the concept of evolution. We understand what the basic premise is, that at one point in time, at one point in pre-recorded history, there was nothing. And then there was the Big Bang, and then there was expansion and inflation of the material that exploded. And over time, and by chance, and again, I understand this is an extreme oversimplification, but I'm not here to discuss all the particulars, all the ins and outs of Darwinian evolution. But now here we are today, and it all began with what many believe to be valid, to be true, the Big Bang. No, the idea is that there is no intelligent design or designer. There was no purpose. It happened. It evolved over time, again, and by chance, as I've already said. And again, here we are today. Moral beings, conscious beings who have a conscience, And when you think about it in that way, so everything began with matter, okay? Matter, time, energy, things of this nature. Everything that we see today began with those very simple elements, I guess I would say. Time, energy, and matter. Of course, the question is always, it's an infinite regress. Where did all of that come from? What caused the explosion? What exploded? How did everything from that explosion begin to inflate? And as it was inflating, how did it become so complex and organized? Science as a branch of study is not really that old. A few hundred years, maybe. So, there was no, as there is today, thousands of years ago, the scientific method and things like this that when we hear the word science, that we think of today. But there have been theories throughout time of how everything began, and not just how they began, but how they evolved over time and by chance to get where we are today. All right, so let's think about this for just a few minutes. So here's what people do typically to, I guess I would say, compromise the Genesis account of creation with the general Darwinian theory of evolution. The days of Genesis chapter 1, the text tells us 5 or 6 times the evening and the morning were the first day. One of the general theories is, those days were not days, they were epochs of time. Kind of the day-age theory. A day is not a 24-hour day as we think of it, but it was an age of time, an age of evolution, the process of growing complexity and things like this. Does that work? And let's ask this question here as well, because what a lot of people do, particularly with the creation accounts of Genesis, is they turn it into mythology. There's a lot of mythology out there. In fact, I've got a copy of the Enuma Elish, essentially the Babylonian account of creation, and it's quite interesting. If you've never read it, anyway, it's a myth on, a historical culture's attempt to explain how everything got here. Maybe that's a good way to look at it. But a myth is basically, and this is within the biblical context, a myth within the biblical context is a non-literal story that reveals a cultural, pre-scientific, pro-Darwinian belief in, again, how we got here, how everything got started, and things like this. Here's the thing. If we attempt to mythologize Genesis, and let's just stick with chapters 1 and 2, but people also struggle with the universal flood of Noah's day. They struggle with the account of the Tower of Babel. And those early chapters in particular, once you get to Genesis chapter 12, people kind of get away from the mythologizing. They look at, just for instance, they look at Abraham as a historical being, and those are historical accounts of his life and his adventures, if you want to use that term. But, pre-Abraham, a lot of people really struggle with the idea that they are literal accounts, and they try to mythologize it. Well, one of the major issues that you're going to run into is if you try to mythologize Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and the creation account. Okay, so just for instance, I'm not going to sit here and read all of Genesis chapter 1. You can do that for yourself sometime, and that would be a good thing to do. So just for instance, Genesis chapter, where am I going to start here? Well, I'll just pick one out. Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 9. Then God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. And it goes down further, explaining, beginning in Genesis 1 and verse 11, the creation of grass and trees and the seed that they contained within themselves so that vegetative life could be propagated. And everything was according to its own kind. And then it says this in Genesis 1 and verse 13, so the evening and the morning were the third day. And that's how the creation account goes throughout Genesis chapter 1. Here's what God spoke into existence. Here's what it looked like. Here's how it came to be. And here's when it happened. Here's the day upon which it happened. So here's the thing. If you try to turn that account into a myth, you are going to encounter, what I would call an endless number of issues in the rest of the biblical text. If you mythologize the early chapters of Genesis, you are going to consistently run into problems from what I would say from Exodus to Revelation. Time after time, you're going to run into issues. So think about it this way. I'll make this statement and then I'll give you some examples. The New Testament, we'll just jump to Matthew. We'll start there. The New Testament constantly confirms the historical veracity of the Genesis account of creation. Now listen, so does the Old Testament. In fact, I'll tell you what, I'll go ahead and do this. The Exodus chapter 20, when the Ten Commandments are being revealed to Moses so that he can reveal them to the Israelites and they can start following the law. Exodus 20, beginning in verse 8. And do this. Put yourself in their shoes. When the Israelites heard this law, what came into their mind? All right? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. This is Exodus 20 and verse 8 beginning. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. Now listen to Exodus 20 and verse 11. So, and before I read that, again, how would Israel have understood work for 6 days, rest on the seventh? How would they have understood that command? Now listen to verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. How would Israel have understood what Moses was revealing to them? Would they had to have go into contemplation over the supposed scientific evidence of creation, or rather not creation, but evolution out of nothing over billions of years and by chance? Is that what their concept was? In other words, did they view the days of creation as literal days of creation, as they were told to work for 6 days and rest on the seventh day? Or did they have some mythological perspective on 6 days of work and 1 day of rest? Well, of course not. Of course not. That's not going to happen. And there are multiple other references, by the way, to this command. I mean, you go to, just for instance, Exodus chapter 31. We're going to move on from this, but Exodus chapter 31, and it really starts in verse 12, where the Sabbath is commanded again. You get down to Exodus 31 and verse 15. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. How did Israel understand that? There's no question in my mind how they understood that. And again, in the original deliverance of the law there in Exodus chapter 20, it's paralleled with, you do this because that's how God did it. You work for 6 days and rest on the seventh, just like God worked in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Now, I know people have trouble grasping that because we've just been, I guess ever since the days of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, we've been inundated with the concept of billions of years. We've been inundated with the concept of the evolutionary processes, time and chance, which that's really what it is, survival of the fittest. And the biblical account has been pushed aside as a mythological account of some ancient culture trying to explain the beginning of everything. That's what's happened to the biblical account of creation. So again, if we're going to try to do that, you obviously you're going to run into problems with the Old Testament. But I want to jump to the New Testament real quick. If we try to mythologize, I guess that's the right word. If we try to turn into a myth the early chapters of Genesis, particularly the creation account. Let me just give you a few examples from the New Testament. All right, I'm going to Mark chapter 10 here, and this is where Jesus is talking to some people about God's law on marriage. Mark chapter 10, and I'll start in verse 6. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. See, what we are supposed to believe is that humans are fairly new to the scene in the evolutionary in the evolutionary chain. We're the latest and the greatest, if you will. We were preceded by a lot of other less complex, less conscious, less moral beings, but now we're here. Well, you look at Mark chapter 10 and verse 6. From the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. Now, that verse there, Mark chapter 10 and verse 7, is actually Jesus quoting from Genesis chapter 2, which people have tried to turn into a myth. Jesus considered Adam and Eve as historical beings who entered into a covenant marriage at the will of God. And incidentally, marriage was the first institution created on earth by God himself. And the two shall become one flesh, so then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So if you're going to mythologize, all right, Genesis chapters 1 and 2, you're going to have to deal with Mark chapter 10, where Jesus tells us that from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. But here's another example of what I'm talking about. I'm turning to Matthew chapter 24, and I'm going to start in verse 37. You know, one of the things I mentioned just back a few minutes ago is that people struggle with the Noahic flood and the concept of a worldwide flood. And, well, that's mythology. Or it was a local flood, it was just really bad, and they thought it was universal. Well, here's the thing. Water seeks its own level. It doesn't flood in one specific region and the water stay there congealed in one area. That's just not how it works. But anyway, Matthew 24, beginning in verse 37, but as in the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Jesus considered Noah and those involved in the ark, you know, Noah, his wife, their 3 sons and their 3 wives. They entered the ark, they survived the flood. And you know what? So does Peter. Peter, in fact, talks about 8 people being saved from the flood in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 20. So if you try to mythologize the early chapters of Genesis, you're going to contradict the historical veracity that Jesus and Paul, and I'm going to look at Paul here in just a minute, that Jesus, Paul, and Peter place in the early chapters of Genesis. They were historical events. They were historical characters, whether we're talking about the institution of marriage or the universal flood of Noah's day. So I'm going to go to Romans chapter 1 here as well and talk about Paul's perspective. I've already read to you Jesus, and I mentioned Peter, 1 Peter chapter 3. But here in Romans chapter 1, and I'll start in verse 19, it says, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So Paul goes back to creation, and he considers it a historical event, a thing that actually took place. And you know, there are other places where Paul talks about that. Not necessarily about the creation itself, but 1 Corinthians chapter 11 talks about, I think it's around verse 8, Paul mentions the creation of man and woman and God's arrangement of man and woman within the home. And then there are some other references. I don't have them in front of me, but there are the point is this. There are multiple references, not only by Jesus, but by writers of the New Testament documents, that the people and events of the early chapters of Genesis were historical people and events. And too many Christians have bought into the concept of what is called theistic evolution. The idea, yes, God did create everything, He began the process, and then yet evolution is still true. They try to compromise the two, and you cannot compromise creation and evolution. You cannot compromise the existence of God with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and remain faithful to the biblical text. It cannot be done. It is not possible. But a lot of people try to do it. A lot of people are very willing. It's interesting to watch Christians sometimes. They're very willing to accept scientific theory. And just as much they are willing to question, whether they realize it or not, they're just as much as willing to question the historical veracity of the Old Testament documents. So there's a statement in this article that was written for me for the paper here. I believe in the Genesis account of creation, and I think it's an excellent statement, and we'll kind of wrap it up here. An excellent statement, or maybe summarization of creation versus evolution, or the belief in, maybe not a total belief in Darwinian evolution, but a belief in, okay, the earth wasn't created in 6 days. There's no way that could have happened. You know, when I hear that, okay, my question is, okay, so you're a Bible-believing Christian, you believe in the existence of God, and yet you're going to tell me that it's not possible for God to do that. You're going to question God's capability as it's recorded in the early chapters of Genesis, because you have been influenced over time by the scientific theory of evolution. Let me tell you, that's a dangerous place to be. But anyway, the statement that is made in this particular article that was written for me is talking about the belief in long epochs of time as opposed to a 6-day creation, as we actually have recorded in the early chapters of Genesis. Here's the statement: time doesn't solve the problems. Man, that's it. Time, the expansive, I don't care how many millions, hundreds of millions, or billions of years you attribute to the current existence of the world, to the current existence of the complexity of the universe, to the current existence of consciousness and conscience itself. And conscious and conscience are two different things, and we need to understand that. Did time, did chance, did biological evolution introduce the idea of consciousness? Did it introduce the idea of conscience? And conscience, I ought to, I ought not, the sense of morality and ethics. Did biological evolution, did the Big Bang, did expansion and inflation of whatever banged, did that stuff, can that kind of stuff, can simply non-living matter produce consciousness? Can it produce conscience? Can it produce ethic? Can it produce morality? Well, of course not. It's not possible. It doesn't matter how long you leave a pile of dirt laying around or a pile of gravel. It will always be that. It will never develop a sense of morality. It will never develop a work ethic. It'll never develop a conscience or a consciousness. Hey, that I'm here. I'm a pile of dirt and I'm sitting here doing nothing. I better get up and do something. And I know that is an oversimplification of the process of Darwinian evolution, but that is it. That is the kind of what you might call the nuts and bolts of it. Everything that we see today, morality, ethic, conscience, consciousness, is the direct result of a big explosion and billions of years of non-living matter evolving into what we have today. While that is an oversimplification of the concept of evolution, those are the nuts and bolts of it. A Christian cannot believe, well, they can, they shouldn't. There's just a multitude of problems with it, and not only biblically, but scientifically as well. Science very well knows that living matter does not come from non-living matter. It doesn't happen. It never has happened, and it never will happen. If you have nothing, you get nothing. Okay, that's just a very basic scientific truth. So anyway, I believe in the Genesis account of creation. Well, that's it for this episode of the FCGN podcast. I appreciate you tuning in today. This is just getting off the ground. This is only the third episode, but Let me say this. If you are interested in receiving Fulton County Gospel News either digitally or through the mail, contact me. You can get hold of us on our website, www.mammothspringchurchofchrist.com. You can visit our public Facebook page, Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring. We also have a public Facebook page for the Fulton County Gospel News, and that's what it's called. You can contact us in any of those ways. If you'd like to receive this paper, if you'd like to learn more about this podcast and some other things that we do a lot of live streaming, anywhere from 4 to 8 videos every week. Goes up on our Facebook page and then is uploaded to our YouTube channel, which is Mammoth Spring Church of Christ. But hey, listen, I've got to get off here. I appreciate you listening today. I believe in the Genesis account of creation. I do. All right, guys. Look forward to seeing you well, I won't be seeing you. Look forward to the next episode. Hope you have a good day, and thanks for tuning in.